COVID Commission and its reformation as a Prime Minister's advisory body, an advisory board. But before I do that, I just wanted to make a number of comments in relation to the COVID-19 situation, updating on my statements after the National Cabinet meeting on Friday. Over the weekend and today, the Emergency Response Centre has been stood up in relation to aged care. That brings together all the key agencies involved in supporting the aged care sector at a state and at a federal level, and that's being headed up by the National Chief Nurse, Ms McMillan, and we thank them for the work they've been doing, particularly over the weekend. The situation in Victoria, of course, the Premier will be updating Victorians and the country more broadly on those matters in his regular press conference. But just to suffice to say that the federal government continues to provide every support, the increasing deployment of ADF personnel across a broad range of tasks, including, as foreshadowed, the door-to-door operations, right through to the tracing supports, logistics command support, support and testing centres, and that will continue. It's important to understand that the challenges, and they are significant in the aged care sector, are a reminder that when community transmission occurs with COVID-19, the aged care sector will always be impacted. That is certainly the experience we've seen in other countries. When you have problems in aged care, it is a function of the community transmission. Now, this is an important point to note because it behoves all of us. If we want to protect the most vulnerable in our community, that's why it's so important that those of us who may be in a less vulnerable position are continuing to follow the advice, performing the safe distancing and other practices about getting tested, about remaining isolated when you're a close contact. All of this is incredibly important because when community transmission takes place, it is inevitable that it will find its way into the more vulnerable parts of our community, and the aged care community is certainly one of those. Now, one of the key things that is being done in the aged care sector currently is transferring people who have contracted COVID into hospital facilities, and we're making use of the private hospitals agreement that we put in place some months ago to free up beds in the private hospital area so we can transfer people out of those facilities into those beds, and we're working closely with the Victorian State Government about that process. I was in contact earlier today with the Premier on those issues. The other part of it is ensuring that the infection control management in aged care facilities is being closely monitored. We have already put some 1.5 million masks into aged care facilities, and about that number and a bit more are also further going into aged care facilities. That's part of a broader provision of personal protective equipment that has been deployed in Victoria. I should stress that the Commonwealth is not the only level of government that provides PPE material into the health system. Of course, the state governments also do that, and in fact are the primary providers of that equipment into healthcare facilities in their jurisdiction, but the national stockpile is being drawn upon to support their efforts to ensure that's in place. It is vital that in those aged care facilities those infection control procedures are being followed. The Commonwealth put in place training for infection control in relation to COVID-19 in recent months, and it's a matter now of ensuring that those infection control procedures are being adhered to strictly in those facilities. Because obviously in aged care facilities you're dealing with the most vulnerable members of our community, and that is where you see the most awful of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is where the loss of life in particular occurs, far more significantly than any other part of the community. Although it is true to say that others who are younger can be susceptible, and it can prove fatal in some circumstances, as we have already seen. So all effort is being deployed to ensure that we're doing what is necessary in the aged care sector. We're also working closely with families. I'd note that the Federal Aged Care Minister, Richard Colbeck, last night was on a Zoom call with one of the facilities and family members from those facilities. There is a single person which is identified for each family who is the contact person, and I'm advised that they're being kept up to date on a daily basis, that single family contact member. Obviously you then rely on that family member to update other members of the family, and that's what's put in place across not just there but all parts of the country is my advice. So we will continue today to focus our efforts, particularly as we have been now for some time, on providing whatever support is necessary in the aged care sector. The news in New South Wales is better, a lot better, and the work that is being done to trace cases to known sources has been very effective, and that gives us obviously a lot more cause for confidence in New South Wales. In Victoria, there is still a long way to go. We are still seeing case numbers at elevated levels, and so as we've seen from other jurisdictions, when you get community-based transmission, it does take some time to get that down. We saw that in the UK, we saw it in Europe, we've seen it in other places that have gone through sustained lockdowns, and it does take some time. So we just ask for the continued cooperation and goodwill of the people of Melbourne and Victoria more broadly to ensure that we can get on top of this, and everyone will continue to work together to that end. Now, moving to the purpose of today's announcement, I'm pleased to announce that the COVID Coordination Commission, as it was known when it was first set up, was set up to assist and be an important channel of advice and channel of action to help the Commonwealth Government deal with difficult problem-solving tasks that are arising because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that extended in everything from ensuring that we had production capabilities for PPE and getting access to testing equipment, through to practical issues about ensuring that we were getting supplies to regional stores and things of that nature. And at the time, I appointed Nev Power to head up that group, and they've done a fantastic job working across so many different sectors and keeping me and keeping my cabinet informed and up to date about what was happening on the ground. We believe that that commission needs to now move into a new gear as we've sort of moved through a lot of those early problem-solving tasks, and as a result, I've decided to re-establish it as an advisory board to myself as Prime Minister to work across the full spectrum of our JobMaker plan. Our JobMaker plan is designed to look at the post-COVID recovery and to set us up for that post-COVID recovery. The work we're doing in deregulation and approvals, on skills formation and skills support, on industrial relations, on infrastructure and transport, on energy, on taxation, all of these areas and key reforms of how we make our federation work better. This is the JobMaker plan that's designed to get Australians in jobs and to keep Australians in jobs, and for those who have been unfortunately put out of a job because of COVID-19, to get them into a position where they can get back into work. It's all about the recovery process, and you need changes and initiatives across a broad range of supply-side elements of the economy. Now, we draw our advice from many sources. Over the course of the pandemic, we have been careful to listen and to listen carefully. We've obviously listened to the health advice, but also and equally we have been listening to the economic advice, whether it be from the official institutions such as the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, or it's been listening to those in the industry sectors, the unions and others who we've drawn advice from through the various processes we've had. But equally, we've been listening carefully to those in the economy who have had tremendous experience in many different sectors, and that has come through the COVID Coordination Commission. And so today, as I said, we are re-establishing that commission and drawing together some new members who we believe will give it a broader spectrum of experience and expertise. So Nev Power will continue on as the role of chairman of the COVID Commission Advisory Board, joined by the Deputy Chair David Thodey, Paul Little and Jane Holden, who have all been serving on it until now. And they'll be joined by Mike Hurst, as you know, Mike, formerly head of Bendigo Bank and a very good understanding of regional economies, Samantha Hogg from Tasmania, who has been very active in the resources and the infrastructure sector and advised on and played roles in many government as well as private sector boards. Sue McCluskey is well respected in regional Australia and in the agricultural sector. She'll be joined by Bao Hung, who's been very successful as founder and group CEO of the Rolled Australia Proprietary Limited organisation, working with as a franchise outfit and working with small businesses right across the country. Paul Howes I've invited to join the group. I've known Paul for many years. We certainly haven't always agreed on everything, as he and I can attest to. But what this is about is getting people to work together. And Paul can bring his experience in superannuation, workforce and workplace relations to assist the work of the Commission. And I thank him for agreeing to join. And Laura Berry, who works in Indigenous business and Indigenous business procurement, will be joining the COVID Commission. This is just about ensuring that we continue to listen and get the best advice. That experience, to draw on it, the expertise that is there. It is not to replace or supplant any other channel of advice that I'm drawing together. The industry bodies, the union organisations, all of those will continue through their formal channels to be putting their input into the government as we continue to roll out our Job Maker plan and add further additions to that plan as we move forward into the budget. The COVID Commission will work within government. It won't be an external agency, it'll work within government and can form part of the cabinet deliberative processes, which is an important innovation. And so as we work through particular submissions, we can be drawing on the expertise and the experience of the COVID Commission as we fashion those plans as they make their way through the Expenditure Review Committee process, the cabinet process, and the decisions that are taken there and what is ultimately placed in this year's budget and other decisions that are made. We're about creating jobs. Jobs is the way out economically for Australia. This is an Australian plan based on Australian values, based on Australian challenges and Australian solutions. And that will continue to guide our efforts, practically dealing with the problems that we face, bringing the best minds together, bringing the country together to get behind the effort to ensure that we recover strongly from the COVID pandemic. We are still very much in the midst of it. We are still very much in the fight over it against this pandemic and the impact that it is having. But we also have a very strong plan to see us recover strongly on the other side. And with that, I'll ask Nev to make a few comments and then happy to take broader questions. Nev.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and thanks everyone. Good morning. First, I'd like to acknowledge the great work that all Australians have done across community and business in helping manage with the coronavirus and maximise the amount of business activity and jobs that we can sustain during the pandemic. As the Prime Minister said, we're in a transition now to focus much more specifically on creating jobs and accelerating the return of our economic activity so that we can restore as many people's lives and livelihoods back to where they were or as close to as we possibly can. The Commission's really gone through three phases. The first was that problem-solving, fixing phase that the PM mentioned, and that was about the procurement and manufacture of PPE, was keeping material flowing through our ports and solving industrial relations issues that came up there, about ensuring supply to remote supermarkets and more recently supply out of the distribution centres that were impacted by the Melbourne outbreaks and looking for and developing alternative means to supply people in those suburbs. In addition to that, we've also worked to connect displaced people into areas of priority to help work with health workers to resolve issues in those areas. As part of this work, we've developed 4 task forces which are working in addition to the commissioners, and these are in energy, advanced manufacturing, not-for-profit and industrial relations, and they're also providing an extended field of advice back into the Commission to help us provide the best solutions that we can. As we move into this third phase, we are very much focused around the recovery of the economy, but of course there will still be problems to solve, and commissioners at various times will continue to do specific tasks. For example, Jane Holton's task at the moment looking at hotel quarantine nationally. We also recognise that as we come out of the virus, or as we learn to live with the virus, parts of the economy are going to be impacted for longer than other parts of the economy. So we need to focus on helping those people, but also on growing and accelerating those parts of the economy that can grow as fast as we can to create as many new jobs as we can, as well as restoring old ones. Clearly, the health and safety of all Australians is the number one priority. In parallel with that, we'll be looking at how we can create as many jobs, get as many people back into work as possible, and learn to live with the restrictions of the coronavirus of physical distancing, personal hygiene, and quick response to outbreaks in businesses across Australia, whether they're in hospitality or mining or infrastructure development or housing construction. So I'd like to add my welcome to the new commissioners. It gives us a very broad range of experience and networks across Australian business, and in particular the addition of deepening skills in small to medium-sized businesses, agriculture and regional Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the great work of our existing commissioners and the people working on the Commission, and thank them for their continued effort as we all try to do our very best to get people back to work and to restore as much of our economy to normal as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Never. Just hang on that note, can I also particularly thank Kath Tanner, who's standing, not going to the next stage. Kath obviously has a very specific role within Energy Australia, and we need to manage conflicts going forward, and Kath's done a great job up until now, and we thank her very much for that. Greg Combay as well. Greg stood down about a month ago, I think it was now, about 3 weeks ago. Greg is still working closely with the Attorney and Industrial Relations Minister, as well as working with the government representing the industry fund sector, and we thank Greg very much for the work that he's done, both as a member of the Commission but also the very practical work he's doing as part of the other process that the Attorney is working through at present. But Andrew, go ahead, mate. You're all fired up, ready to go.
With more than 500 cases today in Victoria, are you concerned about the ability of the Victorian government to be on top of this outbreak? We're hearing stories of people taking up to 9 days to get their test results back, particularly in regional Victoria. That makes contact tracing difficult. When you set up the Bushfires Royal Commission, one of the terms of reference was when the federal government can intervene in terms of an emergency response. Are we heading that way here, first of all? And second of all, does Victoria need to go even harder lockdown here?
Let me pick up the last point first. The Premier has also been pretty clear about that. We're several weeks in now to a 6-week lockdown period in Victoria. The advice to me is it's premature at this point to be making those calls, but it's also important to keep all the options on the table. I heard the Premier say over the weekend that effectively mandatory masks indicated a whole nother level, and I would agree with him about that, and that he will take advice and make assessments, I would think, over the next week or so about what further may be required at the end of the period that he's set out. But I stress again what I said in my earlier comments, and that is we need to be patient. There has been significant community transmission in Victoria that will take some time to get on top of, and that is what the actions directed to addressing right at this very moment. On the broader issues, the federal government has just one job, and that is to support the Victorian government in all of these initiatives. That's why there's more than 1,400 ADF personnel in Victoria right now, supporting across a whole range of tasks to give Victoria every effort, resource that they need to get on top of this. Tracing is clearly a challenge, and that's why so much of the effort and resource has been put into that area. And it is vital that the marks that are set, and that is, and I welcome the fact that particularly in recent days, they have been able to seek to make contact with every positive case. And then there's the further task beyond that of making that contact and then identifying any further contacts of those cases and trying to do that within that first 48 hours. They're the metrics that we set out last Friday at National Cabinet, and that's what the goal clearly is. So the Royal Commission that you make reference to is looking at a very similar issue when you're involved in national crises, and I'll let the Royal Commission do their work on that. Whether that has broader application to circumstances like this, I'm sure people will form judgments about that at the time, but I'm certainly not going to prejudge that. The Royal Commission is looking at that in the case of natural disasters, And pandemics and natural disasters can be one and the same thing, and if not, they're very close cousins, that's for sure. And so I think there will always be lessons out of all of this. But right now, I just have one job, and that's to give Dan Andrews and the Victorian government every support I can to help him help Victorians, and that's certainly what we're doing as a federal government.
What would your message be to the New South Wales community, indeed communities in other states watching anxiously now?
Oh, to stay alert. We've got to keep the tension in the court in all the other states and territories. The virus is still out there. It hasn't left the country. It's still here, and it's not going to go anywhere. And our only defence against it is to ensure that our testing, tracing and outbreak containment capabilities are at the highest possible standard. And for that to be effective, there are certainly things that governments need to do and are doing, and I think what we've seen in New South Wales has been a very effective tracing operation. That despite the threats and challenges that we've seen, they've been able to get on top of that, but they would be the first to tell you that they're not out of the woods yet, and there's still a bit of distance to travel. Those cases are still less than about 20 at the moment each day, but they could raise higher than that. That's not out of the question, but the fact that they've been able to get on top of that so quickly is important. So governments need to do what they need to do, but equally for the rest of the country, it is just a matter of continuing to practice the discipline, to stay in the habit about contacts and about keeping distances and about washing hands and downloading the app and doing all of these things. We must keep doing that until there is a vaccine, and that vaccine has been introduced into the community to establish the immunity that is necessary, and that is still some time away. But you have to do that while keeping your economy going, by keeping people in jobs, and the way you do all of that and protect the most vulnerable in your community is by following the very straightforward and disciplined steps that I've outlined.
Prime Minister, the organisers of tomorrow's Black Lives Matter rally in Sydney say they'll go ahead even if they lose an appeal in the Supreme Court today. How would you describe that decision?
The decision of Black Lives Matter or the decision of the court?
To go ahead with the rally even if they lose in court.
I'd describe it as breaking the law. That's what I'd describe it as, and that's what it is. I mean, we're all subject to the law, so I would encourage everybody to follow the law. So we might there's five journalists here. I was happy to go around and get a question for everybody and then come back to you.
On the economy, the federal government spending $2.5 billion on a contract for asylum seeker detention centres in Australia. How do you justify that level of spending, given there are only just over 1,000 people in detention centres onshore, and we are facing the worst financial crisis in 100 years?
The detention network is an important part of a comprehensive border protection regime that has been the most successful in the world in countering illegal entry into Australia. That's how I justify it.
Mr Power, actually, how heavily focused will you be on IR reforms as your remit shifts to creating jobs?
Our focus is primarily around workplace trends and workforce trends and how they're going to be impacted, and particular focus around transitioning skills and helping people upskill and reskill into the roles that are created and are restored in the economy. The Attorney General has a specific group looking at the industrial relations reforms, so we may have an opportunity to input to that, but it's not our primary focus.
Do you concede the Victorian government has let this get out of control? That the Victorian government is responsible for the fact they haven't done the contact tracing and testing quick enough on top of the hotel quarantine department?
Well, I'm going to respond the same way as I did to my earlier question, Andrew. It's my job to support Victoria, to help Victoria, and that's what I'm going to do.
Do you think 132 cases, though, Prime Minister, today? Just how worrying does that make you?
Oh, it is concerning, and of course we're concerned, and that's why we're putting so much effort into it. But there's nothing to be gained by the federal government engaging in some sort of commentary about this. People don't want commentary from their Prime Minister, they want action. And the action we're putting on the ground is to give the Victorian government every resource and support they need to get on top of this. And I know that's greatly appreciated by the Premier, and I greatly appreciate the support that's being provided by other states and territories who we're working with closely to address the resource needs in Victoria. This has been a national effort. I think one of the things that has really marked Australia's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been the way the states and territories and the Federation has worked together like never before. Now, it's not perfect. We all know that. But as someone who's been around public life for some time, I've never seen the Federation work this well together and in such a constructive way. And what we're announcing today with the COVID Commission is we want to keep that going. States and territories working together with the Commonwealth in the national interest. That's what's needed right now, and that's what's happening right now, I believe. And we're seeing that work in the worst of cases, like in Victoria, but equally in some of the best of cases as well, to ensure that they can continue on in that vein. And so I'll continue to lead a process that brings people together, whether it's the advice that we're drawing from those in our economy, small business people, in the workplaces, those representing employees, those representing employers, investors, whether here or overseas, listening to our health professionals, our medical professionals. You've got to draw all of this advice together when you're making these decisions, and we're doing that as an Australian government in our national cabinet that draws together all the states and territories, and in our federal cabinet, which is the government I lead.
On the recovery, do you think that the Treasurer's comments about a Reagan and Thatcher style approach, do you agree with that? Is that the sort of approach you're after in terms of the recovery?
Well, we're leading an Australian response.